Hi everyone, and welcome to the 12th episode of our Tandem Talks. So for those of you who are new to our Tandem, we are a progressive continuous performance management platform, and this is our thought leadership webinar series, where we invite thought leaders, business leaders, and HR experts to join us and share their thoughts and expertise on a whole range of topics. Today, we are joined by the incredible Cherie Atchison, who is a multi-award winning global diversity and inclusion leader, published author of Demanding More, and keynote speaker. As I'm sure many of you know, Cherie has worked in many regions, developing tailored, data-driven DE and I strategies, and is a passionate advocate for gaining and retaining women in the industry. In 2013, she launched and led the award-winning UK expansion of Women Who Code, which she is now sits on as an advisory board member. The aim of her career is ensuring that people are aware of the fantastic opportunities the industry has to offer and make certain that all humans are able to really benefit and reach their full career potential. Cherie will be joined today by the incredible Aisling Tayard, who is the co-founder and CEO of our Tandem, and they're going to dive into how performance management can and should influence your diversity and inclusion strategy. We do want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please do use the Q&A function at the bottom as well as the chat box, and any questions that you pose will be asked either throughout the session or at the very end in the discussion part. Final thing from me is that this session will be recorded and will be shared right after the webinar too. I do hope you enjoy the session. I personally am really looking forward to hearing from Cherie today, but otherwise I would like to hand it over to you now, Aisling.
Thanks, Lauren, and hi everybody. You're very welcome to Tandem Talks. We are so excited to have Cherie here today. Ever since she agreed to come on board with one of these talks, we've been looking forward to it, and I know we have a lot of excited guests in the audience as well. Diversity is something really close to our heart in Tandem. We really believe that performance management, depending on the design and the metrics you measure, can impact your female very differently to your male colleagues. And we monitor and measure that quite closely in Tandem. And there's often some really interesting data that arises from that. But for now, we're really interested in what Cherie has to say about it all. So I'm going to hand over to her. She's going to take you through a presentation. And then after the presentation, I'll be back on to moderate all your comments and questions. But please feel free to share them throughout the session. We're really looking forward to you being part of this community and driving on our discussion as well. So thanks so much for joining us, Cherie. We're really delighted to have you, and over to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, folks. And thank you for having me as well. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really interested in hearing what you all think as well of performance management hand in hand with diversity and inclusion. So thank you for the great intro. I've been doing senior diversity, equity and inclusion leadership for almost or just over 10 years now, which feels like a very long time. And my work is really rooted in unearthing privilege and exclusion and inclusion in processes and policies, making sure that when we create those things, that actually we create them with inclusion embedded in, or we unearth the exclusion that is there and then we change what's happening. I write a lot, so I contribute for Forbes. So if you're interested in what that looks like, you can find all of my Forbes pieces online. And I'm also the author of Demanding More, Why Diversity and Inclusion Doesn't Happen and What You Can Do About It. But I'm really excited to actually delve into, what does performance management have to do with diversity and inclusion? Now, I think before we even talk about that, what's really important here is actually what is diversity and inclusion. One of my biggest pet peeves is that we use diversity and inclusion as a buzzword or a phrase, whatever you want to call it, but actually we never tend to break it down enough. And that's a really big problem, because when we think about performance management, we really have to be very nuanced by what we're talking about here. So when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about the representation within the room, the different demographics that are or are not represented. And when I'm talking about inclusion, I'm talking about how those groups come together, how they feel a sense of community. Do they feel that they are being treated fairly, non-discrimination, all of those different things? How do they affect different groups of people? Now, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, that's two very different data sets as well. So diversity, that employee representation data, for example, the hiring data, when how you get people into your pipeline or you don't get them into your pipeline, and inclusion, actually, how do they feel? How are they all coming together? How does, for example, performance management work for, let's say, men, women, and all of the other genders that exist as well? Now, what's really key here is actually, what are we doing separately to make an impact together? So instead of just pushing it all under the one thing, what are we doing separately? Because actually, a great example of this is that, higher representation of, let's say, women or people of color within your business doesn't necessarily mean it's an inclusive business, because you have to look at the attrition, the retention, and so on. And again, the progression of those people. How is their performance being managed? So what's the connection here? What's the connection between those two things and performance management? Now, when we think of performance management, the real key part here is that it's nuanced. Just like all of us on this call, none of us on this call are the same. And what that means is that one size does not fit all. As much as that would make everything a lot easier, what's really important is to think about the teams that you sit within, the teams that you lead. Does everybody have the same goals? Now, the answer to that is no, of course they don't, even if it means that everyone wants to get promoted. If you drill down into that, the journey to those goals are different. The smaller milestones will likely be different as well. And actually, like I said, if everybody did have the same goals, the path is very, very different. And that's the key part here, is the difference, the personal touches, the tailored approach that we need to have. So actually, when we manage performances with successes and growth areas, how do we do that succinctly? And that's the really key part here. Whenever we think about diversity and inclusion within performance management, we must think about structure. Now, some people think, structure is too rigorous, it's too bureaucratic and so on. But actually, when you have structure that flexes, when you have a framework that works for people to take the bits that they need, to share the bits that are important to them, to help you support them in a way that helps them learn about their successes, but also tap into growth areas and opportunities to fill those growth areas, then we have a process that works, but it's still a process. Now, the other key thing here is that when we talk about performance management, it's not equal by default. Nothing is equal by default. And that's, I guess, the root of my work. It's that everything is very, very different for different people. Now, processes typically are not created with everyone in mind. And I need all of us to really recognize that. It would be great that when we create a process, or our process has been created in the past, that we could comfortably say, yes, everybody was thought about in this. Women, people of color, people from poorer backgrounds, people with disabilities, neurodiversities, and so on. But actually what tends to happen is that we create processes for the majority of the people within the business, and then we test it with them as they go through performance management and so on. But what about the people on the cusp or on the edge that don't fit into those groups? How can we be sure that those processes work for them? And the answer is we can't until we do analysis. And that's why the stuff that Aisling, I know, is going to share later is really, really important. So actually, to do better on this, we have to change. And that's the key part here. It's very easy to say that we care about this stuff, but we actually have to be meaningful when we talk about changing. And one of the things that I thought was really important when our tandem had shared it with me was that men, for example, were receiving a higher word count per feedback, meaning that they actually might be getting more constructive insights than women, and more men than women are following up on feedback. Now, actually, the inclusion piece is key here because it's ensuring processes work for everyone, especially those in the minority groups. Now, inclusion doesn't happen by default because exclusion hasn't always just been by default. It's been specific. People have made decisions ultimately to create processes based on culture fit, for example, and bias. So for us to challenge those very deliberate decisions, we have to make very deliberate decisions. Now, the other thing here that's really key, and please do keep your questions coming. If you have any questions at all, please fire them into the chat or the Q&A because we're really excited to answer those. But giving good feedback is a skill. Now, no assumptions should be made on who does and doesn't give useful feedback. Now, one of the biggest pitfalls in the industry is that all too often we assume that just because someone has, let's say, a certain number of years experience, that they're really good managers, or they have the ability to be good managers giving useful feedback. Now, that's not the case. And I can probably assume that most people on the call have had an experience of someone who has been moved into a management position, but doesn't have the skills of being a good manager, but they are very technically brilliant. Those two things are very, very different. Now, we have to be very specific about the how, ensuring the why embraces equity and fairness, so really challenging that bias. But that means we, as people within those remits, we have to provide education on giving good feedback, but we also have to analyze the feedback that is being given to see, does it actually make sense? Is it doing what it needs to do? Is it fair? Because when we think of performance management, we're ultimately creating processes that either bring forward new leaders of all different backgrounds or they don't. So it's a really key process when we talk about who moves up our ranks and who doesn't, who moves into strategic roles versus operational roles, who defines the future of the company. And that's where I think it's actually, what can you do? I want you to leave with something that's useful here. So I'm going to go through a number of different things that I think are really, really important when we talk about performance management. Now, the first thing is we have to engage subtlety to create equity. We cannot create a performance management process across the board that works for everyone if we have not tested it appropriately, if we have not really genuinely considered different viewpoints, different needs, flexible working, the impact of life events, societal events, world events like the pandemic and so on how that works for different people. I think what's really key here is that we recognize that, yes, we have one process that is our performance management process, but there is subtlety in how it works for different people. So the first thing is prioritizing psychological safety. Now, by psychological safety, what we mean here is the ability for people to come together to share what they need to say and what they want to say in a way that feels like they won't face any backlash, any issues and so on, potentially from senior folks or peers. Now, the key part here is that when we talk about psychological safety, we're very much talking about everyone being able to share what they need to share their feedback, ask for feedback and so on, share what isn't working for them. But we know that that disproportionately affects underrepresented people because of being the minority in the room, being the only in the room and so on. What I would ask people who are in positions of leadership, who are involved in performance management, who are managing other people's performances is to actively intervene when we see this, to provide avenues for people to share that feel comfortable, that feel safer, so as we can create a process that really brings together all of that nuance and that allows us to make sure that we're not just listening to the majority. I think a really big part of creating any process that works for everyone is actually believing and seeking to learn underrepresented people's experiences. It's very easy to create processes that really work for us because we personally can resonate with it, can understand that, yeah, that works for me. I think that's a good process, but that isn't necessarily what we need to do when we're within a company, for example, or an organization, because people are not monolithic. People are from all different backgrounds, all different everythings. And what's really key is that we seek out those different experiences. Now, that maybe seems like a bit of a tandem to the side or a tangent to the side, sorry. But what's really key here is the learning piece. You can create things by user research, for example. When you roll out a new solution, you create platforms with clients, for example. You do user research to really understand what do they need, how do they need it, when do they need it, and why do they need it. Now, we should be doing the same thing for the processes we create. Of course we should, but more often than not, we don't do that. We make assumptions on what people need. And that's a big fail, obviously, because nobody likes assumptions being made about them. So what I want you to do is seeking out those experiences, but I also want you to not get defensive with what you hear, because you're likely going to hear things that maybe don't resonate with you entirely. They maybe don't fall into the same experiences that you personally have had. But the key part here is that doesn't mean that they're any less valued. That doesn't mean that they're any less important. It just means that they're different. And that's where empathy is really important in performance management, because when we think about setting goals with people, when we think about understanding what their goals are, empathy is really key here, because whilst it might not be aligned to what you think someone should do or is the correct course of action, understanding their point, helping them, guide them, of course, if you have expertise and experience, but understanding that different doesn't necessarily mean wrong. And I think the key part here is when we go on that journey of learning about different experiences, bursting that echo chamber, that bubble that we all live in, myself included, we really want to provide avenues for other people to speak, whether that's in your team meetings, whether that's in your one-to-ones and so on. Think about that psychological safety piece as well. It's all well and good to have awareness of what's happening, but how do you then move that into action? And that's the action piece we're talking about here. When you start to learn about these experiences, when you seek out the different perspectives from your team, make sure that you give the avenues for those people to share. Make sure that you give them those opportunities to step forward and step into new roles, new opportunities, and so on. Because when we talk about performance management, growth opportunities are a really, really big part of that, as you would expect. And we're going to talk about that in a second. I need you to challenge decisions. This is what I meant earlier about doing things differently, changing the way we do things. Friction, when anybody asks me what my job is, the first thing or the most basic way to describe it is I put friction into decision-making processes. My job is to slow people down. It's to get people to sit back, recognize that we can make decisions differently if we stop making snap decisions. Our brains are so hardwired to just make a decision based on previous experience, based on stereotyping, based on affinity bias, recency bias, gender bias, and so on. And my job is to stop people doing that through friction. That means accountability. That means slowing down, all of those different things. Now, what I would ask you to do when it comes to performance management is challenge decisions. When you analyze your data and you see, for example, that men, for example, are disproportionately being promoted regardless of their representation within the company, as opposed to women who are not, challenge those decisions, challenge to understand what is the criteria that we are setting, firstly, within the business. That means disproportionate groups are getting promoted over others. Who is making those decisions? Are they adequately challenging bias? Put friction in that process before a yes or no is given. And that's the key point here, is that the answer might be, these were the right decisions to make. But the answer might also be, actually, this wasn't the right decision to make. And the key part here is putting friction in before we make any decisions that involve people. Because again, especially when we think of affinity bias, people that we see ourselves in, we feel a connection to, it's very easy to have a yes, but we got to stop ourselves doing that. Remember that intention and impact do not always align. And I talk about this a lot because I think, I think it's one of those things that sounds quite fluffy, I'm sure, but I think it's really, really important. And again, please do keep your questions coming into the chat or in the Q&A or anything else. I'd love to hear them. But what I think is key is that when we come to performance management, that we recognize that whilst we may have good intentions with our words, with how we give feedback and so on, the impact may not be as good as we think it is. And a great example of that is, like we talked about earlier, about people that have a lot of experience, a lot of years of experience in a certain role, with the assumption that they will be good managers. Now, the intention there is to give that person an opportunity to step up, step in. But if we don't support them, if we don't give them the education on how to give good feedback, how to be a strong people manager, then the impact is that the team members suffer. And that's not good enough. It doesn't matter that your intention was to help someone shine. The impact is that people are being forgotten about in the course of that other person's journey. And that's where, when we talk about support here, it's really, really key. So what I would ask you is to be actionable about those changes. It's all well and good to say, oh yeah, we've done that, but it's just the way it is. I don't want you to be performative. I don't want you to just make bland statements that when you find out that potentially your process isn't unbiased, that we don't make changes with it. And I think the key thing here is that privilege piece. When we talk about privilege, we talk about processes being made really with certain groups in mind and other groups not in mind. We talk about certain groups being considered when we rework processes and others not. Now, what we are really needing to do is think of all of those different things, recognize the privilege of, for example, being in a majority demographic within a company, whose leaders, whose people who make the decision on your promotion or not, are also within that same demographic. That's a privilege for many obvious reasons. But like I said, the affinity bias, the connection that people have, culture fit, which whilst people say that they don't do it, they do it. And what that means is when we talk about culture fit, what we're really talking about here is people, sorry, my dogs, knew that was going to happen as well. When we talk about culture fit, what we mean is that ultimately people are hiring for their likeness. They're hiring for people that they think will really fit in to what they already have. It's very homogeneous, it's very monolithic, but actually that doesn't create good solutions. That doesn't create solutions for the many. Now, when we think about privilege in that, what we have to recognize is that it's easier for some people to succeed within your performance management processes than others. And I know Ashley is going to share some statistics that she's found within the Tandem platform as well. But what you need to do is you recognize that and then you change based on that. How do you help other people accelerate? How do you make sure that people across the board have access to fair growth opportunities? And growth opportunities is the biggest part of this work. And the reason for that is, how can you possibly get promoted if you haven't had the ability to show that you have strengthened your weaknesses? You cannot do it. Okay, certainly when you think about moving up ranks, when you think about moving into roles that are much more senior level, you can't take on those roles if you haven't proven yourself. And that's certainly more relevant for underrepresented people than those that are not. Again, that privilege piece. Again, now what I think is key here is, how do you share growth opportunities within your teams, within your business? You know, many people will say, oh, we do that fairly because we spend time understanding across the board who needs what and so on. Do you track it? Again, it sounds boring, but one of the biggest things to help change that trajectory, to change that balance, is tracking, writing down, creating a collaborative spreadsheet, a collaborative document, whatever it might be, across the verticals that it makes sense and across the levels that it makes sense, understanding what are the growth opportunities coming up, what is the big fire projects that are coming up that we really need people to jump on, but it also gives them a really good opportunity to show their skills in, let's say, crisis management, stakeholder management, all of those things. If we continually give them to the safe pair of hands that are the same demographics as us and so on, and we're in majority demographics, then nobody else ever gets a chance. And that's where we talk about the support and being structured to how we share opportunities across the board. Because if we don't do that, realistically, anything else that we do will not affect the changes that we want to see. Because when we think of growth opportunities, we have to recognize that they are directly tied to promotions, especially when people need time to showcase that they have taken on board feedback and so on. And you can take on board feedback, but if you don't have an opportunity to show that you're implementing it, then what's the point? What's the use to that? And then I guess lastly, before we go to questions, I want us to recognize how the world works and how it directly impacts processes. Sometimes it's easy to think that we operate in a silo, we operate in a bubble when it comes to our organizations. Now, the last 2 years would tell us that that's not the case. Globally, huge things have happened. The global pandemic, the global connection and rising of the Black Lives Matter movements that have existed for years but came together in the last few years for sure. The awakening on racial injustice, for example, and so on. And what I think is really key here is actually recognizing, how does all of these things influence our processes? And when we do recognize that they influence it, how do we change it? What I would love is that, certainly in the last 2 years, we've seen that, for example, women have been disproportionately impacted by the effects of the pandemic when it comes to the workforce. And we've seen huge stats that gender equality is being rolled back years because of, women, for example, having to stay at home to do the majority of childcaring, and then meaning that obviously they're not now returning to work because of various different reasons. We've also seen in countries, for example, like North America and in the UK. So in North America, those that are the highest hit with redundancy rates and job losses are Black and Latino women. actually white women gained jobs during the pandemic in North America. And in the UK, what we found was that the majority of the unemployment rates disproportionately have affected Black and Pakistani women. So what I want us to think about is, how does that affect our processes? How does that affect the people we reach? How does it affect the people we support? How does it affect the feedback that we give? Does it affect the feedback that we give? The answer is yes. But also, how do we create processes when we think about even remote working now? You know, people working remotely with alongside people that are more in the office. How do you share growth opportunities fairly? How do you make sure that you are regularly connected to those people that are working from home or a different space, to make sure that we don't just align with those that we have recency bias to, that we see all of the time, that we interact with all of the time? The only way to do that is to be deliberate. And that's the main takeaway that I want you to get here. I want you to think about deliberate, purposeful changes, not just, okay, we know we need to do better, so we're going to roll out bias training. That's one thing that you should do. I agree, yes, you should do that. But the other things that you need to do are analyzing the process, defining what good feedback means within your organizing, and mandating training. I don't want no add-on training that people can just opt into, because then the people that you need to go on it won't go on it. And then the other thing is repercussions. This sounds quite heavy, but what I think is key is that when you do all of these things, what happens when someone isn't aligning with, you know, giving fair feedback? What happens when there's still a disproportionate in the people that they rate higher than not, and so on? And there has to be interventions here. And that's what I meant as well at the start about actively intervening. It's not good enough just to continue the way that we're doing. We have to accept, if we want to create an equitable performance management process and an equitable and inclusive organization, we have to do changes. And that means both prioritizing a lot of different things and challenging and changing and removing the things that are stopping us. So I know we're going to go to questions just in a wee second, but again, my book Demanding More, which is really around why do all of these things happen and then what can you do about it, is available everywhere. It has lots of great leader interviews with Anne Boden, for example, who's the CEO of Starling Bank, Mary Williams, who's the globally renowned Chief Tech Officer, and a whole host of other people, really helping people create something that is purposeful, is sustainable, and it scales. And it was listed as one of the Financial Times best books last year in April, which was pretty cool. But I'm really excited to go to questions. I can see that the wee ticker is certainly rolling up and up and up. So I think there's lots and lots of questions coming on. But I would love to bring Aisling back, here she is, to hear what you think and hear some of that data that you mentioned to me earlier as well. I think people will really find that interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Cherie. There was so much food for thought in there. I was frantically taking notes on the areas that you were discussing, and I can certainly resonate with a lot of them. Because there's so many questions and we've so little time, I might hop straight into questions right now, and then we can try and draw out throughout the discussion, and I can try and share some anecdotes and data from our perspective as well. But I'm going to kick off with Kay Harratine's question here. And just a call out to everybody, some people are sending questions to the hosts and panelists only. So if you can send your questions so that everyone can see them, that will be great. So Kay asks us if we can share an anecdote of when input on a process was provided by a marginalized community that resulted in a change, either in the process of the leadership behavior regarding performance management elements. So have you personally seen anything, Cherie, that has created a change?
Oh yeah, I mean, and I think the real key part here is the listening first. So you've mentioned, you know, gathering that feedback. And I think that's where tools like, for example, like Peakon or different employee engagement platforms where you can listen at scale, where you capture from people, what do you need? What isn't working for you? And then the key part of that as well is breaking that insight down by, let's say, gender, ethnicity, and so on. So you can see the different answers that you're getting from those groups. But the key thing is the action. So you listen and then you have action. And what I do is when that happens, I take that into changes. So for example, one of the things that I've seen before when we've gotten feedback that performance hasn't been fair because leaders, for example, don't have awareness of privilege. So every company that I work at, the first thing that I mandate is privilege awareness training for all senior leaders and above. And that means that there's then a baseline education understanding of what we're talking about and how it affects them. But then we also monitor if that changes based on performance rates and so on for different groups within. So the key part there is listening first. You should never do something without listening if you can avoid it, but actually then taking that forward. What I would suggest is that when people do those different bits and pieces, that they do them in a cadence that makes sense for the business too, whether that's every quarter, every 6 months, every year. Don't do them sporadically, because it's really, really hard to monitor progress then.
Yeah. I certainly have come across this a lot, where companies have listened really closely to their people. And two anecdotes I'd share of clients who've moved in this direction is, one is when they look at the self-evaluation element of performance management. So there's a load of research out there that would indicate that women will generally self-evaluate, or will be more modest about their performance than perhaps their male counterparts. And they felt it was very hard to represent themselves fairly. And as well, I think women sometimes exhibit behaviors that go a little bit unnoticed. So that how factor, of how you're doing your job, not just doing your job, but you're the helpful one who helps others do their job really well, or you're the person who always takes the onboarding on and so on. So getting an awful lot more succinct about how you measure behaviors, and having real tools to drive insight into your behaviors, but also giving women some help in how do you collate that insight about yourself. So giving them some tools. And one of the things that we're really particular about in Tandem is providing these coaching dashboards whereby women can go, you know what, this is how I've done, and I've collated all this feedback to kind of provide evidence for how I've done. So it's not just me saying it, but all these other people are seeing these great strengths in me, so that they can draw from the crowd and they can reflect back that great feedback that they're getting in. So I think tips like that to kind of overcome some of the natural barriers that occur, that women will generally draw and, be a little bit more modest, that helps overcome that barrier. The other one is, sometimes I think diversity isn't just about, gender or so on, but it's also about the different profiles that we have, like our introverts versus our extroverts, and how they receive feedback is very different, so our introverts will often want to process and digest feedback that they've seen in their own time and space before they respond. And that can be a problem in performance management. If you have a very extroverted manager who wants to give feedback on a regular basis, and he's just going at it, giving feedback, and the introvert isn't ready to respond and react, that can be quite a challenging situation, because the extrovert think, well, that didn't go well because they were very quiet about it. They didn't respond. But actually it's the opposite. The introvert is digesting it. They just need that time to process it. And again, technology can play a real role there, going, you get the feedback in your own time, but then we come together to discuss the feedback when you're ready. So there's little tricks like that I think can overcome some of the natural biases that can often occur. Okay, I want to move on with the questions because there's so many to fit in. So Ola Bimpi asks us, how can you identify quickly affinity bias? Any tools to help managers minimize this? We are all drawn to our clones.
That's very, very true. I think the only way to help manage or understand that is firstly data. So actually, what does the majority mean within your company? Because it can mean very different things depending on where you're at in the world, what culture you're in, region, and so on. What does the majority demographic look like? Do I sit within that? What are the demographics of the people below me, for example? And then starting to look at actually who do I inadvertently, and spending time doing this, inadvertently map myself to? Who am I drawn to? When we start to get that awareness, because you will see obviously that people are drawn to themselves, you need to create a program that changes that. So for example, one of the things that I have regularly rolled out is when we've done that analysis and we found that, let's say, the majority of the folks in those senior roles are men, and usually white men that are middle-aged, and also the people that are starting to progress up are also white men close to that age group. What we do is we disrupt it and we create a framework that means that those people are paired with different groups of people for sponsorship. What that means is that we create a framework that's based around regular constructive feedback, visibility when they're not in the room, and advocacy when they're not in the rooms that they need to be in. There's a framework that they meet, sort of every month and a half, to make sure that they are getting that feedback that they would probably be giving to other people as they would do anyway, because they're connecting to them, but they're not doing it with underrepresented people. The other key part of that is actually analysing what does underrepresented mean per the region that you're rolling it out, because obviously that's a very different conversation when you think of the different regions around the world. But the only way to disrupt that kind of affinity bias is to unearth it and then create something that forces you and forces leaders to change it. And that's been a really meaningful way. So certainly when I've rolled that out in lots of different organizations, we've seen a significant change, firstly in the support of the people specifically on the program, the proteges you could call them, but also in the long-term shift of the mindset of those leaders when it comes to, for example, assigning those growth opportunities, like I mentioned before, because there's an awareness actually of, I've been doing this for a really long time and I haven't been being fair about it.
Oh, I love that idea. I think it's super. And it really helps because I think there is a moment where you as an organization have to force that growth-oriented feedback to happen, because it doesn't naturally happen. And we can see it in the data, and there's loads and loads of research on this as well, that women will often not get the same privilege of growth-oriented feedback. They're more likely to get praise, those quick kind of, well done sort of feedback. But actually men are more comfortable giving other men growth-oriented feedback, but will often shy away from being constructive with the female, which creates an invisible barrier that no one can really see. But actually it's another barrier to them kind of developing on and moving their careers along. So I think I love the idea that, there'd be sponsorship where you're kind of a little bit forced to give growth-oriented feedback.
Yeah,
I think that's super. And this relates to Linda's question, where she says she assumes that feedback is documented, but in her experience that feedback is verbal. So how do you capture and learn from that? Now, Michelle has happily answered Linda here, and she's suggesting that she gets her to document feedback in a way. And of course, that's one of the real...
Always do that. And that's one of the things earlier when I said, when you realize the way sometimes things are the way they are, you have to change it. This is one of the things you have to change. Because at the end of the day, yes, a lot of organizations' feedback is a lot of the time verbally and so on. What you have to do is start to change that, where if it's verbal, it's also backed up then by an email afterwards, or put in a platform, whatever it might be. But the real shift here has to be that, not necessarily that, okay, it's verbal, it's always been verbal, we need to create something that fixes it or works with that. But actually, we need to change this from being verbal to being at least verbal and written, or just written. Ideally both, because verbal adds a different layer to it, but we have to get people to change to recognize that structure piece is really key when you want to create an inclusive performance management piece.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things we see when we bring in technology, which is all about, helping people build these feedback cultures, the difference in the feedback levels that will run through the company, is incredible. So we think feedback is happening, but we'll often get the feedback from clients early on to go, people are amazed. They've been in this company for 3 years and never received feedback, and they've got 5 pieces of feedback in the first week. So I think sometimes we overestimate how much feedback is actually happening, and until we track it and measure it and kind of push accountability that you are expected to give feedback, it's only then that you really build up a feedback culture. And then it gets easy to measure, well, how much feedback is going to women versus men, and are they receiving the same clarity, the same trusted feedback as others? So I think that you really have to track it to know that it's happening. Otherwise we assume it's happening when it's often not. So Luan, I'm not going to call I think I'm getting your name wrong here, but she asks, so should culture fit be done away with as justification for declining an underrepresented individual and appointing one who is not underrepresented in the workplace or world of work?
The real problem that culture fit has is that we are making assumptions that someone will be better at a job than someone else because they are similar to what's already within the building. And that's a really big assumption, because what we're ultimately saying is that person will provide less friction. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about choosing friction over potentially different perspectives. Now, when we talk about, especially when we're creating software solutions or any solution or client needs or whatever it is, we don't want to create something that is frictionless, because that's not how it's going to be used in the real world. And so, yes, culture fit should be done away with in its entirety. It's very different when you talk about, for example, people aligning to the company values. So, like, for example, what are the company values, the core things that are really important? Those things make sense, and they should be inclusive by default, because you should have considered inclusion within that. Culture fit is very different, and we shouldn't have that. What I also want people to recognize is that when we talk about having, let's say, two people that are equally fantastic at the job, and we have a monolithic team, okay, one of those people belongs to a monolithic group and one doesn't, what will give us the different perspectives that we need and what won't? So if both people are equally as fantastic as each other, but one person maybe gives us a different perspective that we don't have, that's a benefit to your company. And that's why we need to start to think about diversity. When we start to think about bringing diversity into the room, is that it's a benefit, especially when we have monolithic teams. And so that gives us a different edge that we didn't have before. And that's why we need to stop with, culture fit and actually culture add. And I know it's another buzzword that people use, but culture add is really important. Who brings us something that is additive to what we have right now?
Marinda here is agreeing with you in total. She got to it before you did. She's like, absolutely, we need to hire for culture add. Okay, so we have many more to get through. So let's see, what levers or approaches to performance management have you seen work especially well when it comes to D&I? And that question comes from Linda.
I think that the first thing, Linda, is education on what good feedback looks like. This is probably, and I'd love to hear actually, Aisling, what you think about this as well. The biggest pitfall that I see over and over and over again is the assumption that how I want to receive feedback is the way everyone wants to receive feedback. And what that means is that, one, we make assumptions. And like I said, we don't want to do that. But what that also means is that we don't learn about different communication styles. We don't figure out what different, for example, neurodiversity, how that comes into conversations, and you mentioned it, Aisling, introverted versus extroverted. But what that also does is that really creates a bias when we start to rate people. And we have to rate people in performance management. It's how it works. But that biggest downfall is that we don't provide education on it. And that has to be mandated, that education on what does good mean? Why does that mean good? And how do we, like, for example, rate across competencies as well as technology or technical ability, because they're two very different things. The other thing that I think is really important when it comes to performance management is the structure. And Aisling, you touched on it as well. People think, feedback happens all the time, but actually it doesn't. So what does the feedback cycle look like within your company? And create a really open and honest conversation about that, but create communications that reiterate that continuously. Set expectations that when people leave projects, for example, that part of that leaving process is gathering feedback and embedding that across the business. Because otherwise what happens is people that are really proactive about this will do well, even if that means that they're not necessarily doing brilliantly, but they have more feedback than someone that maybe isn't and doesn't understand that I need to capture this. And then they get to promotion rounds. It's like, well, you don't have anything to back up what you're saying. So you need a process that everybody can link up into. But Aisling, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there's so much that you can design into the framework that helps eliminate bias. So one, kind of bringing your people on this journey of, let's start curating our own understanding of our own performance so that people are empowered to go in and go, here's how I've done, here's the behaviors I've lived, here's the goals that I've done, and here's all these other people who can see this in me as well. So you're curating your own personal brand and your own version of your performance so that you kind of can eliminate the bias of one manager's perspective of you. But equally, the manager should be expected to go and get that crowdsourced feedback about you as well. So you've got two sets of data points now that you can bring to the table that is telling you something about you. But we've got to be really careful about how we drive, because there's certain people who will go off and they'll look for feedback and they'll find 5 people who think they're a megastar, so we've got to be really careful about how we implement that strategy and how do we make sure that our underrepresented people are equally equipped and empowered to go off and find that feedback about themselves as well. And then I think there's lots of nuances you can build in with regard to self-evaluation. How do you ask somebody you know, how's Cherie's behaviors? If you kind of go, well, how's Cherie's behaviors? No peer is going to go, well, she's a terrible collaborator. You're just not going to get that data on her, you know. But if you kind of flip things and reverse them and go, well, tell us what Cherie is brilliant at. The absence of data will tell you as much as the data itself. You'll start to see patterns that she's brilliant at this thing, but maybe nobody thinks she's brilliant at that thing. So I think there's lots of subtleties and nuances you can build into your frameworks that really help drive a consistent approach for everybody in the organization. But I think we're running out of time, and I'm really sorry because there's so many more questions and messages here that I love to spend time talking to you about, Cherie, and I'd happily spend the next hour talking to you about this subject easily. But perhaps we'll keep the conversation going offline. But I see for now Lauren has rejoined us, which is usually a sign for us to stop. So thank you so much for all of your insight. There's loads more questions and we'll try and answer them, maybe following up from the session after this. But for now, thank you very much, and over to Lauren.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we could go for another 15 minutes there.
Happily.
But yeah, unfortunately, it is time to come to an end. So thank you so much, Cherie, for joining us today. And thank you, Aisling, for moderating so wonderfully. And also thank you to the audience for participating and joining so well. We had so many questions, and it's always great when everyone's really, really involved. So thank you so much.